Hi guys, it's been a little while since I've attempted to put another video up, my camera's being evil, but I've decided to attempt a little review, and it's on Ash by Malinda Lo. First thought when I opened the mail and got my book was that I was a little bit upset by the relative slimness of the novel. I tend to like my books thick because thick usually means detail, and I like my detail. I also tend to judge the width of a book by the font size, and it's relatively large in this case. So immediately I was panicking, thinking that I won't get enough detail to satisfy, and then subsequently that will mean the characters possibly won't be as developed, or the relationships we won't get to see as much. I'm quite voyeuristic, so I like to really get in there and experience things. And I think that set me in a little bit of a worried mindset throughout all of my reading of this, which could probably tainted my experience. But Ash has been pegged by a lot of reviewers and whatnot as the lesbian retelling of Cinderella, which is also what Malinda Lo, what the author, tells people initially, I guess, to spark interest. And to a certain extent that is the case, but it doesn't dominate the novel at all, and I don't think that it should be something that puts readers off. Quite the opposite, really. First off, one thing I will say is that I love the way, not only the relationship between Ash, who's our protagonist, and Kaiser, who's the king's huntress. I do love how it's handled in the novel, because Malinda Lo consciously created a world which is both, I should say, the novel takes place between the real world and the kind of fairy realm that's within the woods. Within the real world, people don't seem to mind at all if you're in a same-sex relationship. It's just something that isn't an issue in the slightest, and it's treated with the same indifference that a heterosexual pairing would be, by all the characters, even those that you would call bad. It's just a social norm in this particular world, and I really liked that, and it afforded Ash and Kaiser a lot of freedom in that sense, and subsequently didn't make Ash's realization of her love for a female, that wasn't in itself an issue at all for her. It wasn't something that she had to come to terms with. It was just something she instinctively felt, and I felt that was very nice and unexpected. So that's certainly a plus. I think I spoke about the cover art, the fact that I adore it. It's beautiful. And despite the fact that a good portion of the first half of the novel, which is called, I will just find it for you, Part 1, The Fairy, which is based on, there's a somewhat of a love triangle in this story. Not in the traditional sense, I should say. But it's certainly interesting. And I guess it's the central part of Ash's journey. The fairy is a male named, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, but Satine, I think. That's how I pronounced it in my mind. And he's an interesting character. I liked reading about him. Quite aloof, and so you don't really get into his backstory that much until a little later in the novel. And I do quite like how things were concluded between Ash and Satine. Although I will say that she makes a major decision right towards the end, and this isn't really a spoiler, but she comes to this conclusion about what she's going to do, and you're thinking, right, okay, cool, and then cut, and you don't see anything. And I'm voyeuristic. I like to know what happens, and I like to know in detail what happens, and we're not told anything, so it's frustrating. But it does actually work in the context, and it works for how Ash views the events as well. But I was a little bit upset because I was getting all excited and then fade to black, so yeah. Anyway, the character of Sidin kind of dominates Part 1, I guess, in terms of the fairy tale aspect of it. And the majority of part 1 is when Ash is a child, around 12 years old, when an array of things happen within her life that lead to her meeting that character, and lead to her where she is emotionally within herself for later events in the novel. And so whilst I was reading that, I kept being conscious of the fact that I'm getting X amount of pages along and she's still young, and if she's still young then she's not about to form a romantic relationship, and oh dear, I'm running out of pages, what's going to happen? So by the time we got to part 2, which is called The Huntress, obviously I knew that the character of Kaiser would be coming in, therefore she would be meeting the central love interest finally. And again, I was just freaking out because I was running out of pages, and how was I going to be able to invest in this story if there wasn't much time left? So that's the one thing I would say. I wish this novel was double the length that it is. That said, subtlety can work and less is more can work, and I think Malinda Lo did a lovely job with what was provided, and her writing style is beautiful. It's really lyrical, and small details in things you wouldn't expect, especially in descriptions of setting and atmosphere, particularly when Ash is in the woods, which is an awful lot of the novel, because not only is the magical realm contained within the woods, the sort of the fairy realm that Sidine comes from, but it's also a central place for Kaiser as well, being the king's huntress. She's hunting in there, and so a lot of action takes place, and it's also where Ash forms her bonds with these two characters. So, and it's also where she as a character feels the most free and liberated and the most at home. So the woods are a key character in the book as well. I've been rambling, so I'm just going to get to it. I really wanted to give this book 5 stars, but I just can't because it's too short. And that was primarily it. I wanted more. I'm like Oliver, I wanted more. So I will give it 4 stars. But I do highly recommend it. I've seen a lot of negative reviews on YouTube actually for this novel. But I would say pick it up and have a read. I've discovered that it is in a bookstore nearby here, surprisingly. So you can purchase it in Australia. I wasn't aware of that. So, yeah. Especially if you like your fairy tale retellings. I'm a huge fan of fairy tale retellings, and I've discovered Malinda Lo herself loves Robin McKinley's works, and I love Robin McKinley, so that made me very happy. So, yeah, I would recommend it. Read it and enjoy it, and yeah, just have the experience of a relationship that's slightly different from the majority of all the ones that we find in young adult fantasy novels these days. And yeah, give it a go. I recommend it. Ash by Malinda Lo.